So the talk way they everywhere now is what Professor Knife said, and it shook the table. He said, you have 2,000 trucks. You are complaining and confronting somebody that brought 10,000 trucks. And he was talking about the big fight between petroleum unions, smaller marketers, and the Dangote Refinery. This statement alone has been making people argue because it is not just about trucks. It is about power. It is about monopoly. It is about how Nigeria's economy is being controlled. Now let's break it slowly so everybody will understand. The Dangote Refinery is one of the biggest projects in Africa. It is not a small refinery, it is massive, meant to refine crude oil, produce petrol, diesel, aviation fuel, even fertilizers, and change the way fuel comes into Nigeria. For decades, Nigeria was importing fuel even though we have oil because our old refineries in Port Harcourt, Warri, and Kaduna could not work well. That is why the Dangote Refinery was celebrated when it came, because people thought, at last we have a local solution. But the refinery also brought new fights. Recently, Dangote Refinery sacked over 800 union workers. That decision did not sit well with the Petroleum and Natural Gas Senior Staff Association of Nigeria, PENGASSAN. They said, no, you cannot just remove people like that. So they took action. They stopped the supply of crude oil and gas to Dangote Refinery. And because Dangote Refinery is such a big player, that decision was not small. It shook the whole supply chain. Fuel was at risk. Electricity supply that depends on gas was at risk. Even oil production numbers dropped. My people, you see how powerful unions can be. But the matter did not end there. The union later threatened a nationwide strike. Imagine what that means. No crude movement, no gas, no refining, no transport. That kind of strike can shut down the economy in just a few days. People started panicking. Government had to step in. Negotiations had to start. At the end, a truce was reached. Dangote agreed to reassign the workers that were sacked, no loss of pay, and the union agreed to stop the strike. But the battle lines are still there, because this fight is not just about workers. It is about control of Nigeria's oil sector. Now, when Professor Ken Ife came out to speak, he was not just speaking like an economist. He was speaking like someone who sees the deeper battle. He listed what he called 4 monopolies in Nigeria's oil economy: NNPC, NUPENG, Dangote himself, and PENGASSAN. He said these groups are the ones holding the country down. And then he dropped that statement that has now gone viral. You have 2,000 trucks, you are making noise. Somebody has brought 10,000 trucks, and you are confronting him. What did he mean? Let's put it in simple talk. If you are a small player in this oil business, so maybe you have 2,000 trucks moving fuel around. Yes, that is good, but Dangote is coming in with 10,000 trucks. He's building bigger storage, bigger network, bigger power. So, in Professor Ife's eyes, why are you complaining instead of upgrading your own business? He said Dangote did not stop them from using the gantry. He only brought more investment. So in his view, the noise from the unions and the smaller marketers is just because they fear competition. Now, here is the interesting part. Dangote is not just building trucks for fun. He has a strategy. He is rolling out compressed natural gas trucks, thousands of them, to deliver fuel directly from his refinery to filling stations across Nigeria. That move can cut off middlemen. Before now, smaller marketers were making money because they carried fuel from depots and distributed. But if Dangote is delivering direct, then what happens to those smaller marketers? That is the big fear. They say, if this man controls refining and also controls distribution, then what is left for others? Is that not monopoly? But Prof. Elifi is saying the opposite. He says these unions and smaller marketers have enjoyed their monopoly for years, using the power to keep Nigeria on its knees. And now that Dangote is coming with scale and efficiency, they are shouting. He calls them monopolies too. You see, it is a fight of monopolies. On one side, NNPC with its own government monopoly. On the other side, unions like NUPENG and PENGASSAN that can shut down oil at any moment. Then there is Dangote, the private monopoly with money, trucks, refinery. So it is monopoly fighting monopoly. Now pause and think about the meaning. Who is the winner here? Is it the ordinary Nigerian that just wants affordable petrol at the filling station? Is it the worker that just wants job security? Or is it the billionaire the union, and the government, all fighting for control. My people, as you are thinking, don't forget to like this video and subscribe, because these are the kinds of deep gist we break down here in plain English so everybody can follow. Let's go deeper. When the union started the strike, Nigeria's oil output dropped by around 16%. That is a big fall. Investors started to worry, markets reacted, and once again we saw how fragile our oil system is. One refinery, one union, and the whole country can shake. This shows you why some people argue that we need Dangote. They say his refinery and distribution will bring stability, reduce imports, bring cheaper fuel. They point to the fact that Nigeria has been spending billions importing petrol while our own refineries sleep. Dangote, they say, is filling that gap. But let us not forget, monopoly can also be dangerous. If one man controls too much, he can decide prices, he can decide supply, and he can even decide who eats and who does not in the business. That is why critics say government must regulate strongly. They fear that Dangote may become too powerful. Remember, he already has a big hold in cement, sugar, salt, flour, and now oil. That is why when people hear 10,000 trucks, they don't just clap, they also worry. Now let me ask you, my people listening, do you think it is fair to say you have 2,000 trucks, stop complaining because he has 10,000? Or do you think the unions are right to challenge him so that power does not rest in one hand? Drop your thoughts in the comment section. And again, make sure you subscribe because I want to hear your voice in this conversation. This whole fight also tells us something about Nigeria's development. For years, we relied on foreign imports for fuel. Now, a Nigerian businessman has invested billions to build the world's largest single-train refinery. That is not small. But at the same time, we are seeing how one project can shake the entire political and labor structure. It shows we are still building the balance between private investment, government control, and workers' rights. Now, where we left off, we were talking about the scale of the Dangote Refinery, and our professor Ken Ive used the 2,000 trucks versus 10,000 trucks example to explain the imbalance between smaller players, unions, and Dangote's massive investment. Let's put it in very simple terms. Imagine you have a small delivery company with 2,000 trucks. You are trying to compete with someone who has 10,000 trucks, bigger depots, more capital, and faster systems. Naturally, if you start complaining, people will ask, are you prepared to upgrade your own fleet? That is what Professor Eve meant. But we cannot ignore the union side. These workers and unions have rights. They have families, bills, and years of service. When Dangote decided to restructure and dismissed some workers, it was a shock. The unions responded immediately. They used their power to stop supply of crude oil and gas, and that is what shook the system. A refinery is not just a private business, it is part of the nation's infrastructure. When supply stops, the consequences are national. Fuel scarcity, higher prices, inflation, and even power generation affected because many power plants depend on gas. That is why Professor Ive's statement stirred debate. On one hand, he is pointing out the scale difference. Dangote is bigger, smarter, and faster. On the other hand, he is indirectly challenging the unions to rethink how they engage, suggesting that resistance is not always about fairness, sometimes it is about protecting monopoly and control. Now, Dangote's approach is also important to understand. He is not just delivering fuel randomly, he has a clear plan. The refinery produces massive volumes, and instead of letting middlemen take control, he is sending fuel directly to stations with his fleet of trucks. That is efficiency. That is modern business. But for smaller marketers, it feels like an attack. They fear losing relevance. Imagine your business has been moving fuel for decades, and now someone can move 10 times more than you, faster, cheaper, and more reliably. That is why the complaints came. But here's the point Professor Ive emphasized. Bringing efficiency and investment does not mean stopping others from working. Dangote's trucks don't prevent smaller marketers from delivering fuel. The doors are still open. What Professor Ive is saying is stop the noise and focus on improving your own capacity. Invest, upgrade, compete. Don't just cry. Now let's talk about the bigger picture. Nigeria's oil sector is not just about one refinery or one union. It is about the economy, politics, and national security. NNPC, the government-owned company, controls the bulk of crude supply. NUPENG and PENGASSAN, the unions, control labor. And Dangote, a private player, controls investment and distribution. When these four players clash, it affects every Nigerian. That is why understanding this 2,000 versus 10,000 trucks story is more than just numbers. It is about power, influence, and the balance of the economy. Some people will ask, does Dangote have too much power? Yes, the concern is real. When one man controls the refining, distribution, cement, sugar, and more, he becomes a major player that can influence the market. But others argue, isn't that exactly what Nigeria needed? Investment, infrastructure, efficiency, and local production instead of imports. This is the debate, my people. And as you are listening, think about it. Are you on the side of protecting jobs and unions, or supporting big investment that can stabilize fuel supply? Drop your comments, and don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more updates. Another important point to understand is how this fight exposed weaknesses in the system. A single strike could threaten 16% of daily oil output. That is massive. It shows that while Nigeria has oil, the system is fragile. One refinery, one strike, and suddenly the economy feels pressure. That is why strategic investment like Dangote's is welcomed, because it adds resilience, but at the same time, it shows why government regulation and fair labor practices are critical. There has to be balance. And here is where the lesson comes in. Scale matters in business. Prof. Weave's metaphor is not just about trucks, it is about vision, resources, and execution. If you want to survive in this competitive environment, you need to think big, invest in infrastructure, and embrace efficiency. But it also shows that no matter how big you are, you have to engage fairly with labor, government, and other stakeholders. Let's not forget how this affects Nigerians at the grassroots. Fuel price stability, availability at filling stations, and even electricity supply are all influenced by this clash. If Dangote's refinery runs smoothly, prices can stabilize, imports reduce, and more jobs can eventually be created. If strikes continue and fuel scarcity increases, pump prices rise, and the economy slows. That is why every Nigerian should pay attention to this story, not just the business elite.